Alright, longest video, so here's a TLDR up top. If you're wondering how to handle sergeants, it's the easiest way to think of them as like they're men-at-arms, but they have less HP, deal slightly less damage, and they have no ranged armor. That makes them like significantly worse against archers, and they get kinda annihilated by crossbows, but also by lancers. However, they are great against spearmen and horsemen and that kind of stuff because they have a ranged attack, and that ranged attack allows them to annihilate those units, especially in large groups. They're absolutely strong. They are also great for sniping siege weapons, and actually they're the only unit in the game that are throwing a melee attack at buildings, which means they deal more damage to buildings than most other units, at least infantry, non-siege weapons of course. And yeah, they scale well into the late game, but they are a little shitty in feudal. So if that's all you needed to know, then go have fun. Everyone else, we can now look a little more at the details. And we're gonna start out with the easy case of Spearmen. The tooltip for Sergeants says that they are good against melee units, and they have absolutely no reason to be taking bonus damage from Spearmen. So they should be doing good here in this matchup, as they have very high melee armor. And that's absolutely what we're seeing here, both in the 1v1, which is of course kinda unfair because Sergeants are way more expensive than Spearmen, but also in the equalized matchup at the bottom where there's even resources. They still win that pretty much by a mile without any micro. Now the Sergeants would benefit here from being kited backwards or being microed at all, of course, because they are ranged units, and generally speaking, the higher ranged units benefit more from micro than the lower ranged units, especially when up against melee units. But that's not even necessary here. While the Sergeants have a ranged attack, they do not count as ranged units, so they don't take bonus damage from Horsemen, which makes this a very one-sided matchup, of course. On the whole, in total, they cost the same amount of resources, but it can still be argued that Sergeants are more expensive just because gold is, generally speaking, harder to get than food and wood. But we're just gonna ignore that and call everything even here. So far, the tooltip holds true, and the Sergeants beat all the melee units very cost efficiently, just like men-at-arms would. But we're gonna look at the next matchup where it's kind of starting to turn a little bit on the comparison to men-at-arms anyway. Here we see a 1v1 against an archer, which of course is again unfair because archers are a very cheap unit. The archers still deal significant damage though to this sergeant. It's always even upgrades everything of course, and yeah, to even out the resource cost, we have 6 archers against 4 sergeants, and immediately it becomes clear this is surprisingly even, given that this is a heavy melee unit that does not take any bonus damage from these archers. And we compared them to men-at-arms earlier. Men-at-arms would not be taking very much damage from these at all, because they would have 3 or 4 ranged armor here, and as a result have much reduced damage from these archers. So yeah, it's a pretty close match actually. When we were talking earlier about the importance of micro for the higher ranged units, archers have higher range than sergeants, and since these are HRE archers, they have bonus movement speed and are as a result faster than the sergeants. So kiting them backwards is actually very beneficial for these archers. And if we do that, the cost efficiency actually turns over, and as we will see in a second here, even in these relatively small numbers, the archers actually do end up winning this match 6 versus 4, just from kiting backwards, which men-at-arms would take a lot more shots here to be killed, a lot more micro, and yeah, as a result, of course, would still lose because the archers are fast and have higher range, but still. This effect only gets worse as the game goes on. This is Castle Age, what we're looking at now, but even higher numbers. And I'm not even gonna micro these archers anymore. And still, this is going very well for the archers, which is, somewhat counterintuitive. They have these large shields and they look like they can tank archers this the way that men-at-arms can, but they actually can't. They, not very cost efficient against archers, which is something to keep in mind, especially if you're struggling with sergeants. Just build archers to counter them. It's fairly easy and actually very cost efficient. The low ranged armor really it becomes very noticeable here. And this of course would be only worse if these archers were microed. There's also the phenomenon of overkill, which means units might throw too many attacks against one specific unit, and that's especially apparent in high numbers. And this is what actually makes this effect even worse for sergeants in large numbers. Here we see, again, this is 60 against 40 sergeants, and the effect gets even worse here because these sergeants tend to throw too many axes at just a handful of archers. So here even 26, so almost half the archers survive this. Cost efficiency only goes up for, you know, even stronger archers, meaning yeomen that have higher range and very high movement speed, or here we just see longbows that are not very fast but have high range and higher bonus damage. They all do very well against sergeants, surprisingly, and interestingly enough, like these English longbows would have also attack speed bonus on the defense in the whole, and they are, even without the attack speed bonus, doing extremely well against this. Alright, now we look at the first matchup where we're gonna find out whether or not the Holy Scriptures lie to us, and by that I mean the tooltip. Yeah, Man-at-Arms is a pretty tough matchup here, because those are just some tough motherfuckers, honestly, and Sergeants, that's the weaker version of them. This becomes very apparent in the 1v1 up top, where there's no micro, where the Man-at-Arms actually wins with 22 HP left over, which is fairly, you know, dominant, given that they cost the same amount of resources. And at the bottom, we see, you know, the Sergeant again benefits from the micro, but believe it or not, the Man-at-Arm actually wins this with exactly 1 HP left, which is kind of a bummer. Now, of course, because the Sergeants are ranged units, they do benefit from micro, as we've seen before, and this is again noticeable here. In a 4v4 setting, again, the Sergeants get microed very well here. I'm even target firing, which of course helps the efficiency even more. The armor of the Man-at-Arms is not enough to shield the majority of the damage, unlike, for example, against archers, where, you know, the 5 damage the archers deal usually gets reduced to like 3 or even 2 damage. And I think we're looking at like 11 damage by these Sergeants against a melee armor of 3 or 4. That's still fairly efficient, albeit the slow attack speed does not give him a terribly high DPS, which is not something I had mentioned before. Our Sergeants actually have very low attack speed, but we see that with micro, the Sergeants win this, and this is just a 4v4. In larger numbers, this effect would only become stronger, and also in a normal game where they can be microed backward into safe areas where they still take pot shots and throw axes from a safe distance against Man-at-Arms. So on the whole, I think the tooltip holds true, even if it's not apparent in this very example that we're looking at right now. Yeah, the clip above I wanted to highlight briefly as kind of an example. These are HRE Man-at-Arms. They of course have in H3 the upgrades that give them bonus damage to heavy units. There are a lot of, you know, bonus to heavy units effects in the game that the Sergeants actually kind of suffer very badly from, because they don't have as much HP as other heavy units. So they die pretty quickly to that, and here I do my best to micro these Sergeants, but the Man-at-Arms still win because of their high movement speed, being HRE Man-at-Arms, and the like +8 bonus damage that they do here against these guys, which is actually quite terrifying. It annihilates them pretty quickly despite micro and everything. So there is counters, and one should be considerate of them, I think. Now, speaking of HRE, Landsknechte, of course, are a very iconic unit that I want to look at quite briefly here. We can see a 1v1, which of course is terribly unfair because the Landsknechte are way more expensive than the Sergeants. But, you know, of course the Landsknechte deal like bonus area damage in a cone in front of them. And that's actually something that makes the Sergeants weaker to them, I think, because as ranged units, they tend to clump up more than melee units. Man-at-Arms would naturally spread out a bit. So this is kind of making micro even more important. I have also set up an example here where the Sergeants outnumber the Landsknechte because the Landsknechte are more expensive, and this is in an even resources, but I've also used the line formation just to give them, you know, a bit more spaced out area so that the area of effect damage isn't quite as devastating, and we can see that here the Landsknechte are very much struggling to get the same amount of bonus damage that we've seen before. So I guess the lesson to learn here is, if you're up against HRE, focus Landsknechte if you see them among the enemy melee units, even with Sergeants. Now for the next section, we're going to do a brief excursion into AoE 4 basics. Here we see some Spearmen that are being charged by the Knights at the bottom, and they are using what is called the brace ability. This is like an automatic ability that they use when they're being charged by cavalry. It causes the knights to be sort of stunned and not deal any damage. Now, you can get around this with a little bit of micro by pulling your cavalry back just before they run into the spearmen and then charging again right afterwards, because the brace ability will be on cooldown and the knights can charge into the spearmen. They are still fighting spearmen, they're still taking tons of bonus damage here, but on the whole, it's a lot better. Now, if we compare this to sergeants, of course it's a completely different story. Sergeants don't have the brace ability and the cavalry never has to worry about being stunned by them at all. This is part of what makes lancers very effective against them. The melee armor that the sergeants have does not protect them very well against these lancers. The lancers don't deal any bonus damage against any units, but just have naturally high damage, thereby are doing, despite the melee armor, very significant damage against these sergeants. And the microing backwards isn't as effective as the lancers are simply quite quick and can catch up very easily. And we see here the micro still benefits the sergeants quite a bit, killing 2 extra knights here. But on the whole, it's not the same as with spears. Knights do still counter these guys. That being said, we're looking at some French knights here, which I wanted to kind of talk about. If you're playing against French, you're looking at fighting French knights for a lot of the feudal game. And while sergeants are probably doing decently against these on the defense, like if you stay in town center range, you can throw axes at them very cost efficiently, because these knights would be hunting your villages more than killing your units, and for that the sergeants will actually do quite well. Maybe even better than spears, who have to get into range, whereas the sergeants can actually throw their axes from afar and get damage in on these knights more easily. If you think about the game as a whole, however, I might recommend just not going sergeants at all against French, simply because French player would pin you back and you would be stuck in your own base. The alternative to sergeants would be going for Kingdom of France and getting, you know, Chevaliers, which are essentially smaller French knights of your own. And with those you could go out onto the map. You'd be much more active of a player and much more in charge of the match than you would be if you went for sergeants. So I'm not sure if I recommend them against friends anyway. I also wanted to test them out against Keshiks, which also do well against them, but not as well actually, because Keshiks do less damage than knights, but they have the self-healing ability, which is not as strong against the sergeants, because sergeants can focus fire down one Keshik at a time, therefore leaving less room for self-healing, as most of the knights are at maximum HP for the duration of the fight. But they do still get picked off when they're out and about very quickly, because going out on the map with sergeants against knights is dangerous. For completionist's sake, I also wanted to have a matchup of sergeants versus crossbows. This is equal resources, 10 versus 10, but I don't think I'm spoiling much. You know how this is gonna go. They're basically man-at-arms with less HP, and crossbows counter man-at-arms, or at least are designed to. The crossbows outrange them and deal a ton of damage against them, so it's a quite one-sided affair, as we can see here. Now, the whole thing gets somewhat more interesting actually, because we need to remind ourselves, how do man-at-arms do against crossbows? And here we see the, again, somewhat boosted HRE man-at-arms, but also in equal numbers against crossbows. And they kind of freaking annihilate those dudes. They do a lot better here than the sergeants did, which of course is in part due to the lack of micro. Crossbows would be kited backwards and as a result deal much more damage. Also, probably you would want to have some sort of, you know, spearman front, some kind of unit that tanks the damage as the crossbows deal damage, but I did not include that in this test. I also wanted to test the Genoese crossbows that are the Knights Templar specific crossbows that are new. And interestingly enough, I put them up against the same amount of man-at-arms as the regular crossbows. They do end up doing slightly worse though. So, you know, when you're fighting pure man-at-arms, you should probably go for the regular crossbows in order to maximize cost efficiency. However, the Genoese crossbows do deal bonus damage to other units, so that's something to consider as well. Now, siege units are another very interesting case, as one of the few times where it's disadvantageous to be a melee unit is when you're up against these Springalds. They deal bonus damage to melee infantry and therefore deal bonus damage to these sergeants, even though they are technically ranged. Also, their positioning causes them to take somewhat more damage from the Springalds. Now, on the Flip side, however, the sergeants are actually also somewhat better against them, as with their range they have an easier time to snipe these Springalds than men-at-arms would, as men-at-arms have to like oftentimes go in between the enemy units, which are here symbolized by archers, in order to get close to these Springalds and kill them. Sergeants can do that from afar and have an easier time doing this. Springalds still do outrange them and can be microed backwards easily. Another siege unit I wanted to highlight here is of course the Mangudai. It's also a very common anti-infantry siege unit. I've prepared like 3 examples here to show the power of the Mangudai. We are seeing up top sergeants, at the bottom are men-at-arms, in the middle are just a couple of ranged units. The sergeants don't take bonus damage from these Mangudai, even though they would deal bonus damage to ranged units. So on the whole we can see that the comparison to men-at-arms stands again. They basically take this almost the exact same amount of damage here. The ranged units do get kind of annihilated, also because they have a lower amount of HP on the whole than these heavy units do. I'm gonna pause it here at this last volley being fired, because we can see up top the first sergeant has died from a Mangudai shot, whereas the lowest man-at-arm at the very bottom is still alive technically, which that's the advantage that men-at-arms have. They have slightly more HP, therefore they can tank Mangudais better. If you're playing against sergeants or men-at-arms, don't go for Mangudais. They are terrible against either, so stick to Springalds. Okay, this next chapter I'm genuinely excited about. Sergeants are the only units that use melee attacks against buildings, and you know, as they are ranged melee units, they are throwing their axes at these buildings. And I've heard it makes them good against structures, but I didn't know how good until I actually tested it for this video, because it's kind of immense. Here I measured the amount of time 40 sergeants take to kill a fully loaded keep in Castle Age, and it's about 25 seconds and 10 of them die. This was 40 sergeants down to 30. I repeated the same test but with men-at-arms. This is also 40 men-at-arms going up against this keep. Now we should keep in mind, keeps have torch armor baseline, like 6 torch armor, and each torch attack deals in Castle Age 17 damage, I think, so still a significant chunk just taken out of the damage from these men-at-arms just by being fire damage and not melee damage, and this actually shows quite drastically in the amount of time it takes to kill this fort. The men-at-arms take, I think, 38 seconds to kill the entire fort, but they also lose 10 units, so cost-wise it's about the same, it just takes longer. That being said, taking longer is actually a pretty significant disadvantage at this. That increases the amount of time that the keep can be repaired for, therefore you have to deal more damage, it increases the amount of time where reinforcements can arrive, and that makes it actually significantly weaker. Now, a bunch of civs have various abilities and effects or researches that increase the amount of fire armor that buildings have. HRE is one of those civs, and in the bottom example I have actually researched that anti-fire armor. Up top is the same example as we've seen before. It's 40 men-at-arms each time up against this keep, and since there's only 17 torch damage per attack thrown against this building, and with the torch armor increased by 5, we are now looking at 11 armor for the keep at the bottom, and it's clearly visible that this is like that is taken way longer for these men-at-arms to get through, that it becomes way more cost inefficient for them. Now, the torch damage that the men-at-arms do increases when the player controlling the men-at-arms goes into Imperial Age, therefore you could increase this torch damage somewhat. However, like, it's still a drastic effect, and I think it's shown quite well here. 20 men-at-arms die, and the amount of time it takes is roughly doubled actually. And that's without any repairing or, you know, the special ability by HRE that has auto repair on it that would be super fucking OP here. So, generally speaking, if you see the keep having 11 fire armor, don't attack it with man-at-arms. This is of course especially true with the more commonly used defensive research, that is oil. Oil gives them a kind of AoE splash damage effect around them that damages all the units near them. This is especially devastating against man-at-arms, and as you can see here, they take tons of damage and do actually in fact end up losing the battle against this keep outright. All 40 of them die just before they have enough damage to finish it off. Now the million-dollar question of course is, how does the increased armor and the oil affect sergeants? And the interesting part here is I didn't need to re-record the clip. The first clip I showed already was up against a keep that had bonus armor and oil. The sergeants simply ignore both of those things by naturally staying out of range of the oil and dealing melee damage, therefore being unaffected by the fire armor, which I think is fucking fascinating. It's a drastic effect towards the late game. Plus you need to consider that like the sergeants can still increase their damage by being upgraded to Imperial Age sergeants. So without any like damage reduction effects or increased HP on the keep, it's 25 seconds for 40 of them to kill a keep, and without any repair of course. Plus the repairing villagers would be much easier to kill the sergeants, as they can snipe them from afar and don't need to walk up to them to hit them in the face, which I think is just fucking amazing. They rock in the late game against buildings. It genuinely surprised me. For this next chapter I didn't have a good category to put these units in. They're kind of the oddballs of other civs that I wanted to try out how sergeants do against them. And first off we're seeing some Mangudai here with some boosted range and whatnot. And yeah, up top is a Donzo warrior, and both of these matchups I think go how one would expect them to go. The Mangudai are more of a harassment unit and aren't designed to be, you know, straight up combat units, and as a result do terrible when they have to tank the damage themselves. The Donzos, you know, it's not quite a Spearman, a little better than a Spearman, but it also gets annihilated just like any other Spearman. On the other end of the spectrum we're seeing some Zhuge attacking these sergeants, and due to their extremely high damage output against units that have low ranged armor, the Zhuge straight up annihilate those sergeants. On the bottom we have a Mangudai warrior, which is essentially just a melee ranged crossbow. They do very well against sergeants, so I don't actually know how the matchup against Mali would play out. This gets highlighted again by this next clip where putting javelin throwers up against sergeants. This is kind of interesting because on paper the sergeants are supposed to be good against melee units and not against these ranged javelin throwers, and these javelin throwers should be dealing bonus damage to the sergeants but don't, and as a result the sergeants do win this round. Although I don't know if this is actually a matchup you would see terribly commonly. I don't actually know how to play Knights Templar against Mali. Now another thing that makes sergeants a questionable choice against Mali are sofas. We see them at the bottom here at equal cost against sergeants. They do end up winning there 2 versus 3, as they are kind of like knights, and you know, knights do well against sergeants, so sofas do too. Now up top we have warrior scouts, which in turn actually end up doing super terribly against them, which I find quite interesting. It's not a matchup I would have been able to predict, if I'm being honest. There's some bonus damage against infantry for the sofas that helps, and the scouts do not have anything like that, and as a result get kind of annihilated by these heavy sergeants. So, towards the end of this video, something that I wanted to talk about here is something that I do think absolutely needs to be considered, and it's the special position that the sergeants are in that when you enter the feudal age as Knights Templar, you have to choose one of 3 units. And the most commonly chosen units is in fact not the sergeant, but it's the Chevalier. They're not called that, but I call them that. They're essentially like a cheaper, smaller version of the French Knights. And that's why I'm putting them here. They actually do pretty well against the French Knights, where if they're behind in cost they lose, but if they're ahead in cost they do win. So that's roughly even. And there's a reason why these Chevaliers are the most commonly chosen option among Knights Templar players, at least as far as I can tell. And it's that they are like very straightforward in terms of their playstyle. You combine them with archers who fend off any spears, and beyond that you have just this unit that is a strong map presence that allows for harass. They're kinda the polar opposite of the sergeants in that they are extremely easy to understand and feel like a unit you're already familiar with, even though you've never played with them. They are great for like defending your pilgrims that you're gonna wanna have as Knights Templar player, and overall give you a very straightforward playstyle, which I think is a huge benefit in an RTS that is complex enough as it is. On top of that, they do well enough against buildings, as we can see here, and most importantly, when the villagers do decide to run, the Chevaliers can actually hunt them down and kill them pretty easily. Now, this effect is kind of amplified here by the fact that these villagers don't have wheelbarrow, but you know, it would also happen if they had wheelbarrow. If we play through the same scenario, with sergeants doing the attacking, A defending player wouldn't even bother putting the villagers into the tower because the sergeants can kill it quite quickly. However, you can just run the villagers away because the sergeants cannot pursue them very well. Now the villagers would be even faster than they are here because they again forgot to get wheelbarrow, so the damage that they're taking now is kinda not damage that they would take in an actual game, I don't think. So as far as harassment and, you know, threatening your opponent's resource gathering goes, sergeants do a lot worse. Plus you have to consider, these sergeants are now out in the middle of nowhere, and when playing against, for example, Mongols, they are in a very vulnerable position. So, I don't know, I don't think I'd pick sergeants when I was playing against the Night Sith. I don't know, I'm not a pro player, so, you know, maybe I'm wrong. Any other ideas? I'm genuinely open to all opinions here. In conclusion, sergeants are an extremely unique unit, and I think there have been some complaints about the fact, like, you know, how are they melee, they're clearly ranged, this doesn't make any sense. How are newer players to, you know, understand that? And I think that's actually kind of a valid criticism. At the same time, personally, I easily play enough AoE 4 that it's not a problem for me, so I'm not gonna complain too loudly about it. I feel they are strangely addictive. I don't know, the fact that they are so good against buildings is something that you do actually kinda miss. When you play Knights Templar and you hit the late games and you don't have sergeants to, you know, attack those buildings the way you could have if you had gone for them in the feudal age, that is kinda frustrating and kinda, I don't know, there's something you just wanna have them at some point. But at the same time, whenever I pick Chevaliers, it's so much easier to play Knight Archer with them. I'm not sure. I think at the end of the day, it's probably gonna be a matchup-based thing, where against, you know, maybe against Night Siths, you also wanna be with Chevaliers and Archers, and against Siths that have like super strong Archers, like for example English, you probably also wanna have Chevaliers. Now, against other Siths, however, I can totally see Sergeants being a thing. If you make it into the late game, the attacks can be devastating, and who doesn't want that? You know, I want that. Yeah, and with that, I'll leave it to all of you. Did I miss anything? I couldn't test Japan because I didn't have the DLC on my second game, so sorry about that. Although if people are actually interested in this kind of a video, I'd totally buy a second version of the game when it's on sale at some point and, you know, just use it to make some experiments like I did here, because I actually found this quite interesting to make for myself, so I hope I didn't miss anything. If I did, let me know. If there's enough interest of this, I can make more videos like this one. Until then, I'm Trash, and I see all of you in the next one. Bye bye.